firing indiscriminately into the air from time to time, and then I could hear them chanting or singing. Some of the shots they fired hit the big Friendship department store, and a British correspondent with me said some also landed in the diplomatic compound, but we don't know if anyone was hit. Just why this big convoy has moved east, away from the city, is not clear. What we do know is that unless it changes course, they're headed directly for the area being held by the 38th Army. That's the army said to support the student movement. This sudden burst of activity has made things very tense, as it came just as the Australian embassy, like the Canadians, had started to evacuate diplomatic staff and families, students and tourists, who have been trying to get out of Beijing for the past week. Two of the Australians I spoke to just before the evacuation were still unsure whether they would be able to leave here today.
Other people are having a lot of problems trying to even get air tickets out. It's gone crazy.
Just keep my fingers crossed.
Is there any other way that you can get out?
Walk.
Hundreds of people relieved to get out of here had to wait for several hours to get aboard their jets. I understand a big evacuation of Americans will also start tomorrow.
It's not only a matter of whether the army will stage another major offensive, it's only a question of when.
In the midst of the confusion and unpredictable shooting, one of the hardest jobs in the city is caring for the continual stream of wounded, as the BBC's Kate Adie found after she managed under great difficulty to get into one of Beijing's hospitals. The Liberation Army and the police knocked on doors throughout the city all night. For those who didn't get out in time, a fate probably predictable, decided by a merciless army. As the roundup continued, a very shaky, very unwell Deng Xiaoping, still the paramount leader, despite his condition, presided over a meeting of his hardliners. Shortly after Deng's appearance, the government again said that on May 27, the night of the army's raid on Tiananmen Square, nobody was killed. The city is scared, and for the students still here, they know that before sunrise tomorrow, there could be a knock on their door and a ride to the martial law office from where they may never return.
This rally in Shanghai was a focal point for mourning those killed in Beijing. Thousands of people converged on the People's Square to listen to graphic descriptions of events in Tiananmen Square last weekend from survivors. It was an acid test for the student movement, which is fragmented compared to their counterparts in Beijing.
Civic leaders here have pledged they won't use military action against the citizens of Shanghai, but the International Federation of Students has been banned, and the leaders have been asked to turn themselves into police.
There are signs that normality is returning to Shanghai after barricades around the city were lifted. Public transport has been restored and the street life seems normal. In Shanghai, Mark O'Brien, 7 Nightly News. Commerce would leave the authorities in a crisis.
And with great caution, the capital of China is trying to restore some sort of city life, but it's far from normal. As a few shops opened their shutters for the first time since the army moved on Tiananmen Square, soldiers on trucks and on foot made it clear that the government is very much in charge. The troops have been making sweeps of the city all day, shouting and singing from the backs of their trucks, "We love the people, we love the capital." We heard the songs, but we could not fail to see the machine guns in their arms. Chinese television says at least 400 pro-democracy students have now been arrested in Beijing alone. Tim Skinner in Beijing for 7 Nightly News. China is now clearly worried that Feng Lizhe and his wife Li Xiushan may try to leave the country, probably for the United States. Airports in all cities have been warned of a possible escape attempt, and security on roads and seaports out of China has been stepped up. Although nobody has seen the man China calls a counter-revolutionary activist, it's believed Feng is deep inside the heavily patrolled American embassy, and that the U.S. ambassador has no plans to turn him over to the Chinese government. With life slowly returning to normal for Beijing residents, it is far from ordinary for the diminishing army of foreign news crews still here, still trying to keep up with the government's campaign to shut out reality. For the second time in a week, BBC journalist Brian Barron has been arrested, his passport seized, and Barron ordered to remain in the country. In fact, this morning, we were all informally advised we may soon be arrested and ordered out of the country. The Army's Seek and Arrest campaign to round up students and dissidents is still the government's biggest story. The propaganda broadcasts on television say more than 1,000 have now been arrested around the country, charged in brief military hearings, and in many cases dealt with swiftly. Tim Skinner in Beijing for 7 Nightly News. Observers here say the Army should make its move tonight to clear the square before the Sunday invasion by tourists and families. We'll see this occupation of Tiananmen as a victory for the students and a dreaded loss of face for the government. But it's not all bark and no bite. The Army this morning arrested and detained an American NBC television news cameraman trying to get pictures of the military airport for 7 News. He's been released, but the Army is holding his camera. Meanwhile, the weight is becoming unbearable. The government is making it clear that Li Peng is still the Prime Minister. The students say they won't budge until he's toppled, and all over Beijing, the people are asking when, if ever, the Army is going to make its move. In Beijing, Tim Skinner for 7 Nightly News.
Good, thank you, gentlemen. One of the more extraordinary facets of the weeks of turmoil in China has been the relative freedom Western journalists enjoyed reporting events there. And it was, after all, those graphic television pictures of the student protests that showed the enormity of what was happening in Beijing. It's not clear whether the Chinese authorities planned it this way, but now those television pictures, beamed to the West, have been turned against the students to deadly effect. Chinese diplomats in Western embassies have monitored those television newscasts and then sent tapes home to Beijing, where they've been used to hunt down student activists and others who bravely spoke out for democracy. Now, perhaps because they've served their purpose, the journalists themselves have been singled out, with warnings they will be shot on sight if they photograph or tape military activities. Joining us now, 11am's reporter in Beijing, Tim Skinner, who's been personally confronted several times by the armed troops. Tim, why do you think the police are moving so heavily against journalists now?
Well, Don, good morning. It's very hard to say why they're turning. It's obvious that they are turning against us. It's hard to know why they're making a new concerted move, and probably in the next 24 hours we have been given to understand that the very limited freedom of the foreign media here in Beijing is likely to be curtailed very soon, possibly between now and this time tomorrow.
In the case of the BBC's Brian Barron, he has had his passport confiscated and told that he cannot leave the country even if he wants to at this stage.
Right, and we have no idea whether that's the sort of thing that may happen to us here. It's not surprising. There are not many of us, and what we are reporting is flying directly in the face of the government's propaganda. I mean, every hour of every day since the Army attacked the students, the government's been running news broadcasts on television claiming that no students were killed. In fact, that there was no conflict at all on that night of the massacre. But we were there, and we saw the tanks and the machine guns, and we saw the way the Army did its killing. And I guess that we were really the remaining witnesses to something the Army says didn't happen. The other witnesses were the students who escaped, and now the Army's rounding them up one by one. They're being arrested and taken to police stations or Army depots, and then they've been punished in some way. But that leaves us, and we have the pictures of the massacre, and we've seen how the troops have fired at random into the crowds and into the buildings. And it does make sense, I guess, that the government would want to silence the embarrassing truth that we are broadcasting.
Tim, what is the feeling amongst the Western journalists there that they should get out now or continue trying to report?
It's vital that we continue to try to get the story out of Beijing. There's too much to just turn your back on and leave, although with the reports this morning that there's likely to be a move against us very soon, it is certainly a bit nervous for the people who are here. The cameramen and the photographers, they're the people who are really at grave risk, because martial law does state that anybody with a camera is the target. Anyone can be shot on sight if they raise a camera. If they are carrying a camera, they're in danger. I mean, we've seen people, Bob Goodall and myself were very close to some troops just a couple of nights ago, and we did see some non-camera carrying reporters fired on. This is the sort of danger that they're exposed to. So there is a feeling of great caution, not necessarily fear. No one is leaving their hotels after sunset now. There is an undeclared curfew, but there's certainly a very declared warning to us to stay in the hotels after dark and don't go on the streets at all with cameras. Of course, everyone is trying their very best to get cameras out in bags under their coats any way possible to record the pictures that we're not supposed to. And you're seeing these, somehow we're getting them through by devious means back to Australia every night. But we want to continue trying to do this.
Right. Tim, just moving on, have you heard any latest on the situation at the American Embassy where allegedly Mr. Feng is still being detained or being helped by the Americans?
Well, Feng Lizhe is still in the embassy. We know that, and the American ambassador has confirmed that the United States is providing safety to him. The embassy is surrounded by troops, and we've been given to understand that the United States may be considering, it hasn't happened, or we don't believe it's happened, but it may be considering safe passage out of Beijing for Feng's wife. How this could be done is the stuff novels are made of. It's a huge compound, there are lots of gates, and I suppose she could have already been smuggled out to the airport. She may have already gone. But then that could be just one of the hundreds of rumours we hear every day.
Tim, let's leave it there for the moment. Not necessarily tell you, but take it easy, be careful. Our man in Beijing, Tim Skinner, and he mentioned the name Bob Goodall, cameraman for Channel 7 out of Perth. They're obviously doing their best to get the stories back.
The Rogue Gallery, broadcast on China television, is of 21 leaders of the unofficial students and workers movement. The freedoms they called for 2 weeks ago are a thing of the past. If caught, they face an equal chance of life in jail or the firing squad. Chinese official television has now reached new heights of distortion. Western TV pictures are now being manipulated to show the alleged guilt of students. In one instance, the state-run television has shown a group of students that claims were feasting in the Beijing hotel while supposedly on a hunger strike. That's the government story. But the electronically generated date on the video reveals that these pictures were taken 7 days after the students ended their hunger strike. But these days, the government is confident of its control over the people, and it shrinks from nothing and no one. Tim Skinner in Beijing for 7 Nightly News. Tim Skinner in Beijing for News World. Tim Skinner in Beijing for TVAM. Tim Skinner in Beijing for 11 a.m.
Beijing, gateway to China, a city with more man-made wonders than perhaps any other on earth. A city with a reputation for hospitality, a city which gives its all to tourism, but a city which tourists would be wise to avoid at all costs. The events of the past 3 weeks have transformed the capital of China from one of the world's most desirable tourist destinations into one of the most, if not the most, unsafe cities you could wish to visit. Gone are the smiling, friendly faces. The crowded streets, which were until last month a joy to share, are now the territory of unsmiling soldiers, armed and ready to shoot. Not just dissidents, but as they proved last week, tourists, with or without cameras. You don't have to provoke the soldiers to pull the trigger, you just have to be there. Beijing is a city ravaged by a government army, which has shown how quickly and brutally it'll turn on its own and then turn neighbor against neighbor. The events which followed the massacre of thousands at Tiananmen have left the incoming flights to Beijing almost empty, and for good reason. There's little to do and less to see in safety. Of the 11 major hotels, 5 are now closed. Those still open are less than 30% full. Banquets and buffets go begging. Tables remain empty. Hotel staff have little to do. Taxis, usually abundant and very cheap, are hard to find. Nobody's controlling their fares at the moment, and they won't take you if they're nervous about your destination. Hundreds of shops remain closed, and warnings for all to see make it clear that there's no wisdom in staying here. Hundreds of shops remain closed, and warnings for all to see make it clear that there's no wisdom staying here. The Forbidden City remains forbidden. The Great Hall of the People is only for the army, and Tiananmen Square remains the province of tanks and armored cars. Bleak and friendless it might be, but this is one of the few times that you can visit China's greatest edifice and be here alone. But for the time being, that's the way it must be, because at the moment, China is no place for tourists. Tim Skinner on the Great Wall of China for 11 a.m.
Well, as we've just heard, the events in China are solidifying. After the easy roundup of hundreds of students, the hunt is now on for another named and much publicised 20 others. Meanwhile, the diplomatic impasses continue at the American and Australian embassies. And as we've discussed over the past few days with our reporter in Beijing, Chinese authorities are now moving against Western journalists. After a week of harassment and some 8 sets of television cameras being confiscated, 2 more journalists have now been ordered out of the country and another one has been arrested. 11 a.m.'s reporter Tim Skinner joins us now from Beijing. Tim, I'm told that your passport has also been confiscated.
Morning, Don. Well, I'm not sure exactly what the terminology is with my little incident. It's certainly been taken, but it's been taken very politely, and I hope to get it back today. I suppose let's just say I have a visa complication. I'm here as a tourist, and I happen to be here during a very important story. And of course, any journalist anywhere, when a story breaks, is still a journalist. I am endeavouring to arrange an interview with one of the top-level army people, and having tried to set that up yesterday, I was called to present my credentials and identify myself with my passport. And very politely, they did inform me that I still was a tourist, and I had to conduct myself as a tourist.
But in effect, you are there without a passport now, Tim. Sorry, Tim, you are now without a passport at the moment.
Yes, but I hope that the next couple of hours will change that situation. I don't think I'm under arrest. If I'm under arrest, it's a very comfortable arrest at the moment. They've certainly been very polite about doing what they've done. But that could change, but I don't think so.
Tim, you were, in fact, we were talking on the phone earlier this morning. You were telling me the story that you revisited a hospital that you'd seen on the night of the big bloodbath in Tiananmen Square. Tell us that story, please.
Well, you remember just after the Tiananmen Square massacre, the pictures we sent back of the tragic confusion in the capital hospital, where there were bodies in the corridors and there were nowhere near enough beds for all the injured, where the floors were literally flowing with blood. I went back to the capital hospital yesterday to find a doctor who was on duty on that night. I didn't find the doctor, but what I did find was that the beds were almost all empty. It begs the question, where are the thousands of injured? And in fact, where are the bodies of the students? Nobody will say anything about it. Nobody can find them. They have disappeared.
Tim, just briefly, what's the general situation in Beijing now? I presume it's still very tense around the embassies of America and Australia?
Well, we're seeing the city get back to a semblance of normal life, if you can call living with the army on every corner normal. The crowds are back. Many of the shops are open. But the only area you can't get to is Tiananmen Square. It's still totally surrounded by troops and all carrying those AK-47s we've been learning to live with every day. Most of the tanks have gone, but there are still about 20 armoured personnel carriers around the zone. But the city really is living on the edge of a knife, I think. It's as normal as it possibly can be. We have no idea when the troops will finally go. What does happen, though, every day now, more and more on the hour, the state television and state newspapers are bombarding the people with stories other than the uprising. They're telling us how the refrigerator boom is better than ever, tourism is returning to normal, which of course it's not, and they're still denying that the army killed a single student. And the big story, as you've mentioned, is that the government is asking for as much family help to find the growing list of students and workers alleged to have had some involvement with the uprising in Tiananmen Square.
All right. Tim, let's leave it there for the moment. Thanks once again for your report. Tim Skinner, our man in Beijing. And obviously it's surprising, actually. I'm surprised that the government continues to allow us to have those telephone calls coming in out of the country, even though they're stopping many of the satellite feeds.